In the middle of the 19th century, the state of Georgia stood at the center of America's cotton empire. The red soil around the Ocmulgee River shimmered in summer heat, and everywhere the fields stretched to the horizon, an ocean of white fiber that the world could not stop buying. Cotton was wealth, cotton was status, and cotton was power, but behind every bale and every polished plantation house stood people who had no freedom at all. They labored from the first color of dawn to the last echo of the night whip, building fortunes they would never share. Plantations were complex machines powered by human lives. Overseers kept meticulous ledgers, rows of names, ages, and assigned tasks. Each entry represented someone's body and time. The men who turned the heavy gins, the women who picked and cleaned, the children who carried water and fed the mules. At the heart of this system was the cotton press, a piece of wooden and iron machinery that crushed and compacted the fluffy harvest into tight, transportable bales. It was loud, dangerous, and relentless, the mechanical heartbeat of an entire economy. In 1851, Georgia's cotton industry was reaching its peak. More than 500,000 enslaved people lived in the state, most of them working on plantations of more than 50 acres. The value of their forced labor dwarfed even the profits of gold and shipping combined. To the world market, the South appeared prosperous. To the people who made that prosperity possible, life was an unbroken chain of exhaustion and fear. Each season brought new quotas, new debts, and new punishments for the smallest failures. The language of ownership saturated every document of the time. Enslaved people were listed next to livestock and tools, insured against injury, and mortgaged to banks as collateral. The law offered them no personhood, yet within the closed circles of plantation life, they formed families, shared songs, and built invisible networks of care. A whisper could travel from field to field faster than any rider, carrying hope, warning, or quiet plans of resistance. Among these voices were countless children. Many were sold away from parents so young that they remembered no other home than the quarters behind the main house. They were put to small tasks at first, carrying water, feeding animals, fetching tools. In time, they were absorbed into the endless rhythm of the cotton fields. For those who worked around the machinery, the risks were constant. Hands crushed between gears, backs twisted under weight, lungs filled with lint that turned each breath into fire. By the 1850s, whispers of resistance were spreading across the South. Newspapers in Savannah and Augusta wrote nervously about acts of defiance on isolated plantations, broken equipment, missing tools, small fires that flared and died before the overseer arrived. Most were desperate attempts to claim a measure of control, to say no, in a world where that word was forbidden. The cotton press, designed to compress the harvest into perfect squares, became an ironic symbol of this pressure. The machinery that crushed the fiber also mirrored the system that crushed lives. In one Georgia county that year, a report circulated quietly among planters about an incident involving a child worker and a damaged press. The details were quickly buried. Local papers mentioned only that discipline was required. To historians today, the sparse record stands less as a single event than as a window into the daily tension of the time, the fragile balance between enforced obedience and the human instinct to resist. Whether the damage was accidental or deliberate no longer matters. What matters is that it revealed the cracks inside a system that called itself orderly. Behind every ledger entry and every economic statistic were individual souls. Some prayed for deliverance, others plotted escape along the secret paths later known as the Underground Railroad. Even in the deepest isolation, enslaved people found ways to remember who they were. They taught songs that disguised maps, carved initials into fence posts, and passed on stories that preserved identity, when every other right was stripped away. The 1851 cotton press story, half recorded, half forgotten, became one of many fragments showing that oppression breeds both tragedy and courage. For every overseer's whip, there was a hand that refused to stay idle. For every law written to ensure silence, there was a whispered hymn of endurance. Georgia's red soil still holds those echoes, the rhythm of feet in the rows, the rasp of metal, the heartbeat of a people who survived. By the time the Civil War began a decade later, those countless small acts of survival had eroded the foundations of the slave economy. Plantation owners could measure profit, but not spirit. Machines could compress cotton, but not the will of human beings. The story of the cotton press, like so many others buried in courthouse records and faded diaries, reminds us that history is not only written by those who held power. It also lives in the quiet defiance of those who refuse to surrender their humanity. Today, when historians uncover fragments of these lives, they face the same question that haunted the South in 1851. How much of civilization's progress is built on unseen suffering? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, demands remembrance. To look away is to repeat the past. To look closely is to honor those who endured it. The hidden archives exists for that reason. Every field, every document, every tool left behind tells us something about who we were and who we still are. In the story of Georgia's cotton press, we don't find a tale of vengeance. We find a mirror held to a society that once called cruelty normal. What remains is not a headline or a scandal, but a lesson. Power without conscience always collapses, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually rises like dust in the light. In the middle of the 19th century, the American South had transformed into what the world called the Cotton Kingdom. No place embodied that title more completely than Georgia. From the coastal plains to the rolling interior hills, thousands of acres were covered in the pale shimmer of cotton plants, their blossoms promising wealth for those who owned the land and despair for those forced to work it. To outsiders, it looked like prosperity. Ships left Savannah's ports stacked high with the raw material that fed British mills and northern factories alike. Yet behind every bale and ledger, there was a system that turned human beings into moving parts of a great, grinding machine. Power in Georgia was measured not just by land, but by the number of people one controlled. A wealthy planter's status was counted in the bodies listed under his name. To maintain such dominance required an intricate machinery of social, economic, and legal enforcement. Laws were written to make bondage permanent. Religion was distorted to justify obedience. Even the architecture of the plantations, the grand house, the fields laid out in precise order, the rows of cabins, was designed to remind everyone who held authority and who did not. Each element reinforced the idea that this hierarchy was natural, inevitable, and eternal. The cotton gin, invented decades earlier, had revolutionized agriculture by making it possible to process fiber faster than ever before. But that same innovation demanded a larger workforce to keep the machines constantly fed. As technology advanced, human suffering deepened. The cotton press, with its wooden beams and massive screws, stood as the final stage of the process. Day and night, the rhythmic creak of its timbers echoed through the fields, a sound that meant wealth for the few and exhaustion for the many. The planters spoke of efficiency, yet it was efficiency built upon endurance and fear. Every aspect of plantation life was recorded in cold precision. Books were filled with numbers, bales produced, pounds picked, hours worked. Even a person's worth was reduced to an entry in the margin. This obsession with measurement created an illusion of order, as if cruelty could be managed like an enterprise. The overseers, often poor men seeking status, were the enforcers of this order. They were caught between the demands of the owners and the silent defiance of those they watched. To maintain control, they relied on intimidation and routine. Routine, after all, was the true weapon of the Cotton Kingdom. It crushed hope not through open violence alone but through repetition, the same days, the same commands, the same endless fields. From the vantage of history, it is tempting to see these plantations as static places, frozen in sepia tones, but they were living systems, pulsing with motion and tension. Every sunrise marked a negotiation between domination and survival. Enslaved workers learned how to move within the system, how to endure without surrendering entirely. A wrong glance could bring punishment, but a shared look could signal solidarity. Power was visible everywhere, yet beneath the surface ran an invisible current of resilience. The planters prided themselves on control, but in truth, their empire was fragile. It depended on compliance that was never fully guaranteed. A broken tool, a missed count, a field left slightly underpicked, any of these could ripple through the system. They responded with stricter rules, harsher schedules, and deeper suspicion. The more they tightened control, the more brittle their world became. The cotton press, that emblem of strength, became a metaphor for their society, always turning, always pressing, always one misstep away from collapse. For the enslaved, that machinery defined existence. Its sound marked time as surely as the rising sun. The younger children would hear the creaking and learn early that it meant work to come. The elders, too tired to speak, would rest beside the quarters and listen, each groan of timber reminding them of all they had endured. Over time, the press became more than just a tool. It was a symbol of the system itself, a reminder that every push of its lever demanded human hands, human strength, and human sacrifice. And yet, within that relentless rhythm, moments of quiet humanity still survived. The same hands that picked and pressed cotton also played instruments carved from scrap wood. The same people who labored by command whispered songs that carried history in their melody. These songs, passed from one generation to the next, became the heartbeat of survival. Each note was an act of remembrance in a world that sought to erase memory. By 1851, Georgia's planters had convinced themselves their order would last forever. Cotton prices were high, the markets booming, and their political power unmatched. But beneath the wealth lay rot, the moral kind that grows when a society builds prosperity on suffering. The overseers could measure production, but they could not measure spirit. And within the cabins and fields, the quiet murmur of defiance was already taking shape. The people who worked the presses and tended the fields were beginning to sense something that no law could suppress, that even the strongest machinery can be stopped when the will to resist begins to turn in the opposite direction. It is here, in this tension between power and humanity, that the real story of the Cotton Kingdom begins, not as a tale of prosperity, but as a slow unraveling. Georgia, in 1851, was not just a place of wealth and order. It was a place haunted by the sound of its own making, a place where every creak of the cotton press echoed the question that would soon break the nation apart. How long can power survive when it forgets the value of the human soul? Morning on a Georgia plantation did not begin with the sun. It began in darkness, long before the horizon turned gray, when the night air was still heavy and cool. The first sounds came from the quarters, the crack of a door, the soft shuffle of bare feet, the low murmur of people preparing for another day that looked much like the last. There were no clocks in these cabins, but the rhythm of life was measured with perfect precision. Long before the bell rang from the overseer's porch, the workers already knew what hour it was. Habit had become its own timepiece. The plantation itself was a world within a world. Its center was the big house, a symbol of wealth and command. Around it spread the barns, the smokehouse, the tool sheds, and, on the far edge of the property, the quarters. Rows of small cabins stood there, built of rough timber, their roofs patched with whatever material could be found. Smoke curled from low chimneys, carrying the faint scent of cornmeal and ash. Inside, the cabins were cramped, but they were also places of community, of whispered stories and guarded laughter. Life under bondage tried to strip people of identity, yet the enslaved rebuilt identity every night around the dim glow of a fire. At first light, the entire plantation stirred to motion. The field hands moved in groups, men and women together, forming long lines that stretched toward the horizon. Overseers rode alongside, calling out assignments. There was no need for cruelty in every moment. The system itself enforced obedience through exhaustion and fear of consequence. Work began when the dew was still wet on the cotton leaves. Bent backs filled the rows, and by mid-morning the fields shimmered with heat. The air turned thick with lint, coating the skin and clinging to eyelashes. The rhythm of labor was both mechanical and deeply human. Each worker developed a personal pace, fast enough to meet the quota, careful enough to avoid mistakes that could invite punishment. Older hands taught the younger ones small tricks: how to twist the stem so the ball came clean, how to move down the rows in a line that left no gaps, how to make the body work long after it wanted to stop. It was knowledge born of endurance. The overseers often misunderstood this quiet expertise. They believed it was submission, when in truth it was survival. By noon, the sound of the fields softened as workers paused for a short meal. The rations were simple: cornbread, salt pork, molasses, but those few minutes offered something rare, a breath of autonomy. People spoke in low voices, trading stories, passing bits of food, or humming snatches of melody. These fragments of rest became a hidden culture, woven from memory and necessity. Music, especially, carried meaning. A tune could be both a prayer and a signal, a reminder of home and a map for tomorrow. Afternoons were the hardest. The heat pressed down until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Sweat darkened clothes and stung eyes, and yet the fields had to be cleared, the cotton gathered, the tools maintained. The younger children, too small for full labor, carried water to the rows. Their laughter, rare and fleeting, was the only bright sound in the endless monotony. It reminded everyone, if only for a moment, that life still existed beyond labor. Evening brought no true rest. Once the day's quota was met and the fields quieted, there were still chores: feeding animals, mending tools, cooking the evening meal. Some nights, when the overseer's lantern disappeared, people gathered outside the cabins. They sat in circles, their voices low, telling stories that had traveled across oceans and generations. These stories were not written in any book, but they carried a history deeper than the ledgers in the main house. They told of ancestors, of freedom, of a world that existed before chains. Faith took many forms here. Some prayed in secret, blending the Christianity taught by their owners with the older rhythms of Africa. They spoke of deliverance, of rivers that divided bondage from liberty. Others found faith in simple endurance, in the knowledge that surviving one more day was itself a kind of resistance. To the planters, these gatherings were harmless. To those who attended them, they were sacred. Each word spoken under the stars affirmed a truth the world denied, that every person, no matter how confined, still carried the spark of self. The structure of authority on the plantation was precise but precarious. Overseers answered to the owner, drivers to the overseers, and the field hands to them all. Yet beneath that chain of command was another network, invisible but strong, the quiet cooperation among the enslaved. When someone fell ill, others covered their tasks. When a family was separated by sale, the community remembered their names, ensuring they were not lost to time. In this way, memory itself became an act of defiance. The young often grew up never knowing a day of freedom, but they learned quickly how to read the landscape, which paths were safe, which corners of the property held shade, which sounds from the big house meant danger or opportunity. They became experts in the geography of survival. A child could look at a field and see not just rows of cotton, but a pattern of movement, where to step, where to hide, when to pause. The plantation trained them to labor, but unintentionally, it also trained them to observe, to wait, to think. When darkness returned, the machinery of the cotton press began again, turning the day's harvest into heavy bales. The air smelled of oil and fiber, and the rhythmic creak of wood filled the night. For those lying in the quarters, that sound was inescapable. It was the anthem of their captivity, the lullaby of an empire built on their exhaustion. But within that sound also lived something else, a promise that the press, like all things built on injustice, could not turn forever. To live under such conditions and still find ways to laugh, to sing, to raise children, and to dream was a quiet miracle. It was proof that dignity could survive even in the harshest soil. Each morning began with darkness, and each night ended with it, but in the brief hours between, people carved out fragments of humanity that no law could extinguish. The cotton press stood at the center of the plantation's industrial heart, a tall, creaking monument of wood, iron, and leverage. To the planters, it represented progress. To those who worked around it, it was a constant reminder of power turned mechanical. Its purpose was simple: to transform the soft, delicate fiber pulled from the fields into dense bales ready for the market. But within that process, every movement of the press told a deeper story, one of ambition, control, and the uneasy marriage of technology and exploitation. Each press was a marvel of its time. Built from thick beams of oak, it rose high above the ground, its frame anchored by stone and reinforced by iron bolts forged at the local blacksmiths. At its core was a massive wooden screw, turned by a long beam or sometimes by mules walking in endless circles. When the beam moved, the screw descended, pressing the cotton tightly into a wooden box below. The fibers, light as air at first, were forced into a compact block weighing hundreds of pounds. When the bale was tied, hoisted, and marked with the plantation's brand, it became a unit of wealth, destined for the ports at Savannah and beyond. The press was more than machinery. It was a symbol of the South's self-image. Planters saw themselves as both gentlemen and engineers, masters not only of land and people, but also of technology. They wrote proudly in journals about the efficiency of their presses, the smoothness of the screw, the strength of the wood. They compared models, measured output, and calculated costs. Yet in their ledgers, the most vital element of the system, the human labor that powered it, was reduced to a number or a note in the margin. The machine received maintenance, the people did not. The irony of the cotton press was profound. It represented the modern age in a world built on ancient injustice. The same society that celebrated progress in mechanics resisted progress in morality. Each rotation of the press's beam was both a triumph of ingenuity and a testimony to how far that ingenuity had strayed from conscience. The cotton industry prided itself on precision, on the perfect compression of every bale, yet it failed to see that it was compressing the very humanity of those who sustained it. For the workers who loaded and bound the cotton, the press was alive. It groaned, it breathed, it answered every motion with sound and weight. They learned to read its moods, the way the wood creaked before it cracked, the way the iron pins shuddered when the load grew too heavy. Accidents were common, few were recorded. The machinery demanded constant attention, constant motion, and those who operated it became experts in its rhythm. In their hands, the act of pressing cotton became something almost ceremonial, a final stage in a day's worth of labor that stretched from dawn to darkness. But even as it symbolized the height of Southern industry, the cotton press also betrayed its limits. It could produce bales faster than ever before, yet it still depended on human strength to feed it, tie it, and move it. It stood as a monument to dependence, a machine that could not function without the very people the system sought to devalue. This contradiction hummed quietly beneath the sound of the press, unnoticed by those who claimed to own it. To walk near one of these machines was to feel its presence. The air around it vibrated with each turn of the screw. Dust floated in shafts of sunlight like snow, coating every surface. The smell of raw fiber mixed with oil and sweat, creating a scent that became the signature of the South's prosperity. To those living through it, this environment seemed eternal. The press would turn today, tomorrow, and the day after, its rhythm marking the passing of the seasons like a heartbeat. Yet history was already preparing to still that heartbeat. Across the country, a growing chorus of voices was beginning to question the morality of the system that powered these machines. In newspapers and churches, debates about freedom and labor grew louder. The very technology that enriched the South was also linking it to the world beyond, where abolitionists printed pamphlets and spread their message. The cotton press, once a local symbol of mastery, was becoming an international emblem of contradiction. Progress built on pain, modernity rooted in bondage. To the enslaved, however, the press held another meaning altogether. It was a reminder that every act of creation contained the possibility of transformation. The same motion that turned fiber into trade could one day turn oppression into memory, and memory into understanding. In the creak of its beams and the churn of its gears, some heard not just the sound of labor, but the faint echo of change, a rhythm that could not be silenced forever. By the middle of the century, as the nation edged closer to division, the cotton press stood as both marvel and warning. It showed how far human skill could go when guided by profit, and how little it meant without compassion. Its shadow fell across every ledger, every port, every fortune made from cotton. And when the Civil War finally came, many of these machines were left to rust in empty fields, their wood warped, their screws still. They remain in a few places even now, silent relics of an age that mistook production for progress. The cotton press teaches us that every machine carries the values of the world that built it. In 1851 Georgia, it carried both pride and guilt, wealth and suffering, precision and blindness. It was not evil in itself, yet it became an instrument of an evil system. To understand it is to understand the paradox at the heart of the cotton kingdom, that humanity's greatest tools mean nothing when they are turned against the very people who make them possible. If the cotton fields were the face of the South's economy, then resistance was its hidden heartbeat, soft, steady, and impossible to silence. Within the plantations of Georgia, every human being who labored under bondage learned, sooner or later, the delicate art of defiance. It rarely appeared as open rebellion. Instead, it lived in gestures so small that overseers often missed them. A task done slower than expected, a tool misplaced, a whispered warning passed from cabin to cabin. Each act was a quiet declaration that the mind could remain free even when the body could not. The world around them demanded obedience, yet beneath that surface, an invisible network pulsed with courage and memory. In the evenings, when the day's work ended and the cotton press finally fell silent, people gathered in the dim spaces between the cabins. There, voices rose in songs that seemed simple to an outsider but carried meanings layered deep. The rhythm of the music disguised messages about escape routes, about time, about hope. A single repeated phrase could signal when to move or whom to trust. The planters thought these melodies harmless, little more than folk tunes to ease fatigue, but the singers knew better. Their harmonies were a code, a living language built from rhythm and endurance. Through it, they remembered names lost to sail, stories carried from distant coasts, and the unbroken line of those who refused to disappear. Resistance also took the form of preservation. Women kept seeds hidden in cloth bundles, passing them down through generations as reminders of lands left behind. Men carved small figures from wood, symbols of strength or guardians for their families. Children learned the meanings of these objects long before they learned to read the words their masters prized. To keep culture alive in a world built to erase it was a triumph of imagination. It said, "We are still here." Faith, too, became a refuge and a weapon. In the quarters, scripture and tradition intertwined until neither could be separated. The stories of deliverance, of Moses, of Daniel, of Jonah, were retold not as distant miracles, but as promises whispered through time. Deliverance might not come tomorrow, the elders said, but it would come. Every prayer was both spiritual and political, every hymn a statement that injustice would not last forever. Even those who could not risk open worship found ways to pray in silence, their thoughts rising above the noise of the fields. Some resistance was practical, aimed at survival in the most literal sense. People shared stolen bits of food, treated each other's wounds with herbs, and hid the sick from overseers who might punish weakness. The system demanded efficiency. The community answered with compassion. Each act of care became a small victory against the machinery of dehumanization. When a person was sold, the rest of the group kept their memory alive through stories, ensuring that absence did not mean erasure. The planters could divide families, but they could not divide remembrance. Information traveled farther than the masters imagined. Rumors of freedom drifted southward like wind. Tales of northern abolitionists, of free black communities in the cities, of ships that might carry a person beyond the reach of ownership. Few could act on those stories, but simply knowing they existed changed everything. Hope became a form of resistance, the knowledge that another life was possible, that someone somewhere was fighting for that possibility, kept despair at bay. Even when the horizon seemed endless, that faint idea of freedom glimmered just beyond it, guiding minds toward a different dawn. On some nights, the forest beyond the fields echoed with faint movement. Travelers known as pilgrims slipped through the trees, runaways seeking safety, or messengers carrying news from other plantations. Those who stayed behind sometimes helped them, leaving food near a fence post, marking a path with a broken branch, offering a moment's shelter. These were risks of the highest order. To be caught meant punishment not just for one, but for many. Yet they did it anyway. Solidarity, once learned, was stronger than fear. The most profound resistance, however, was inward. It was the decision to keep believing in one's own worth when every voice around denied it. Mothers taught their children to stand tall, to remember their real names even if they were forbidden to speak them aloud. Fathers passed down lessons in work and patience, knowing that knowledge would outlast oppression. The act of teaching, of preparing the next generation for a freedom they might never see themselves, was both heartbreaking and heroic. By the early 1850s, the network of small rebellions across Georgia had become part of the South's unspoken reality. For every law enforcing silence, there were 1,000 quiet refusals to obey it completely. These acts did not topple the system overnight, but they preserved the humanity that the system tried to crush. When emancipation finally came years later, it was not the beginning of dignity, but its long-awaited recognition. The people who stepped into freedom had already carried that freedom within them for generations. Resistance is often imagined as something loud and explosive, but in Georgia's cotton fields, it moved like a whisper through the rows, persistent, unseen, and unstoppable. It was a force that neither iron nor law could contain. In the long nights between one sunrise and the next, those whispers became the soul of a people who refused to vanish. They worked beneath the stars, dreaming of a time when no one would own another, and though that dream took decades to reach daylight, its first breath began right there in the quiet defiance of the human heart. By the early 1850s, the South stood at the height of its prosperity and on the edge of its unraveling. Cotton wealth seemed limitless, bales stacked high in warehouses, ships leaving the port of Savannah laden with white fiber that fed the mills of England and New England alike. Planters congratulated themselves on having mastered both nature and commerce. Yet beneath those gleaming surfaces, the foundations were beginning to tremble. The small, persistent acts of endurance and resistance that pulsed through every plantation were not only moral defiance, they were subtle evidence that the entire economic structure rested on borrowed time. The more the system tried to tighten control, the more it revealed its fragility. The planters' ledgers told one story: production, output, profit. But in the margins of those same books, the signs of decay were written in smaller letters: tools lost, cotton spoiled, workers ill, a mule gone lame. Each note was a reminder that human will could never be fully mechanized. The South's economy relied on the illusion of perfect obedience, yet every slowed motion, every whispered delay proved that control was never complete. Overseers responded with harsher discipline, which in turn eroded loyalty, creating an endless cycle of tension that no machine could smooth away. In the cities and ports, the contradictions became harder to ignore. Merchants who shipped cotton north read newspapers filled with abolitionist arguments and moral appeals. Ministers who preached order on Sunday felt uneasy when the verses about justice and mercy echoed back from the pews. Even those who profited most began to sense a dissonance between their prosperity and their conscience. They defended the system publicly but wondered, in private, how long it could last. A culture that prided itself on honor was beginning to see the cost of its silence. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing faster than the South could adjust. In England, factory laborers organized for better conditions. In the North, reformers spoke of universal rights. Ideas traveled with goods, printed on pamphlets slipped into crates or carried in letters between traders. Each shipment of cotton became a carrier of contradiction. Wealth built on bondage arriving in lands that proclaimed freedom. The hypocrisy grew visible even to those who tried not to see it. The enslaved community's endurance made this hypocrisy impossible to forget. Every Sunday service held in the quarters, every child taught to speak with quiet pride, every melody that drifted across the night air was a living challenge to the myth that people could be property. The more the planters insisted on mastery, the more they revealed their fear of losing it. That fear leaked into politics, speeches, and sermons, becoming the anxious heartbeat of a society that sensed its own moral corrosion. Economically, the cracks widened. Dependence on forced labor kept innovation slow. While northern factories experimented with new machinery, southern plantations relied on the same old tools, because progress threatened control. The very system that claimed to ensure wealth was also preventing adaptation. Plantation owners invested in land and people, but neglected infrastructure, banking, and education. By binding themselves to cotton, they bound themselves to stagnation. In this way, resistance did not need to be open revolt. It worked silently through inefficiency, through exhaustion, through the quiet refusal of a system to sustain itself. Yet it was the moral collapse that loomed largest. Writers, travelers, and even some Southern thinkers began to describe an unease they could not name, a sense that prosperity built on human suffering carried a curse of its own. Plantations looked orderly by daylight, but at night the stillness felt haunted. The songs rising from the quarters did not fade. They lingered like echoes of judgment. To some, that sound was beautiful. To others, it was unbearable. Either way, it could not be silenced. In small towns, debates grew sharper. Editors printed defenses of the Southern way of life, only to receive letters questioning the justice of it. Churches split over the issue. Families argued across dinner tables. What had once been accepted as destiny now felt like choice, and with choice came responsibility. The great machine of cotton production, once thought eternal, began to creak under the weight of conscience. For those enslaved, these shifts were invisible but deeply felt. They could not see the political arguments in distant capitals, but they could feel the change in the air, the hesitations, the softer tone of a master who once shouted, the rumors that traveled faster than before. Freedom was still far away, but its outline had begun to take shape. The cracks in the system were not yet collapse, but they were sound enough to hear. By the decade's end, the South remained outwardly strong, yet inwardly divided, a civilization trapped between its prophets and its principles. The cotton fields still gleamed in the sun, but the shadows had lengthened. Each whisper of resistance, each question of morality, each act of quiet endurance was pushing the weight of history toward an inevitable reckoning. The great contradiction of the age could not last forever, and somewhere deep in Georgia, beneath the endless rhythm of the press and the rustle of the cotton, the truth was already rising, steady, unstoppable, and near. When the century turned and the echoes of the Old South began to fade, what remained were not the ledgers or the bales of cotton, but the memory of how a world built on power eventually collapsed beneath its own weight. The plantations that once seemed immortal stood empty, their grand columns chipped and pale, their presses rusting in the fields where the grass had reclaimed the earth. The men who had measured their worth in acres and lives left behind diaries that now read like confessions. And the people who had once been denied humanity walked forward into the uncertain light of freedom, carrying with them the wisdom that endurance had carved into their bones. History, when viewed in black and white, often appears as a series of opposites: master and slave, wealth and poverty, cruelty and compassion. But the truth of Georgia in 1051 lived in the gray between those extremes. It was a landscape where human invention reached new heights, even as morality sank to its depths, where the same hands that built machines of progress also bore the scars of their consequence. The story of the South's cotton empire is not merely one of tragedy, it is one of revelation. It shows that no system, however powerful, can outlast the truth of its own injustice. As decades passed, the memory of those who labored in silence became the foundation of new voices rising in strength. Their songs turned into hymns of remembrance, their prayers into the language of civil rights, their hidden acts of defiance into lessons for a world still learning what freedom truly means. The cotton press that once crushed fiber into commerce became a relic of warning, a reminder that technology without conscience turns progress into oppression. The soil that once fed on sorrow now nourished new growth, and in that renewal lay both justice and hope. Scholars, writers, and descendants would later walk through the remnants of those fields, tracing the outlines of what was lost and what was found again. They saw that history was not a chain of events but a living current, carrying forward both the weight of suffering and the power of redemption. In every age, humanity faces its own version of the cotton press, a system, a machine, or an idea that promises advancement while hiding the cost of its creation. To remember Georgia in 1051 is to recognize that progress cannot be measured by wealth alone, nor by the elegance of invention, but by how deeply it honors the dignity of those who sustain it. The unnamed, the unseen, the unheard, these were the true architects of survival. Their endurance transformed history's darkest machinery into testimony. They remind us that even in the deepest shadow, The act of remembering is resistance, and the act of telling is deliverance. The black and white photographs that remain of fields, of faces, of worn wooden structures leaning under time, are not just images of the past, they are mirrors held to the present. They ask what kind of world we are building now, and what stories will one day be told about us. And so, the tale of the dwarf boy, the cotton press, and the empire that once believed itself eternal becomes more than a story. It becomes a reflection of the human condition. Power, when stripped of empathy, devours itself. Freedom, when born of endurance, reshapes the world. The South's greatest lesson lies not in its grandeur or its fall, but in the truth that every life, however small, holds the capacity to shift the course of history. In the quiet turning of that truth, the cotton fields of Georgia fall away into the distance, and what remains is the steady heartbeat of remembrance, a sound that, once heard, never fades.